Welcome to All About the Archers. I'm Philippa and I'm joined by Quentin today because we are here to talk, it's so exciting, to Sarah Hehir, who is a scriptwriter for The Archers and is, drumroll, the scriptwriter for The Archers this very week. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's really good to talk to you. I think we've all loved this week, the highs and the lows of the week. Was it a fun week to write?
Do you know, I did actually find it quite a fun week. There was a lot of space, I think, as a writer to find your way through the stories. There's obviously a couple of big threads going through there. But yeah, I mean, the George and Brad storyline was just like a line or two in the story pack. We discussed some ideas at the story meeting and it kind of grew from there. So that was fun because that's quite nice where you've got space to play with the story as the writer, because obviously some of the bigger stories, they have a trajectory you have to follow.
Before we started recording, you said that you actually wrote this back in August. So there's obviously quite a big lead time between the writing and the actual broadcast. What's it like to listen to live when you've written it a few months back?
Mostly it's actually quite nice because it feels quite fresh again. I think if you listen to it straight after you'd written it, you know, we get, it depends, somewhere between a week and a half and 2 weeks, depending which time of year you're writing to write the script. So it's quite intense. You're writing 6 scripts in a short time, and yeah, so you're kind of immersed in it in a different way. So that space is nice because you step back as the writer and get to listen a little bit more like the audience. But it's always a little bit tense. The actors are great and the directors are great. So you trust the team that it's going to be nicely produced, but you do wonder sometimes how some of your ideas are going to land. Yeah,
does it always come out how you heard it in your head when you wrote it?
Not always, but strangely quite often, because I don't know about the other writers, but I know that we all listen, and I don't think unless you listen avidly, firstly, you wouldn't enjoy it. I don't know why you'd be on the team. But also, it would be really hard to write because I hear them in my head. I hear their voices in my head. That's, it's really beautiful. Every time you start writing a pack of, a week of scripts, you're not quite sure. You've got your plan and everything and you know what you've got to get to. But, Eddie's line, all that glitters isn't built in a day. Eddie said to me, I almost can't take the credit for it. Because you hear their voices, certainly when it's going well. I think if I'm struggling with a scene, it's because it either doesn't feel like it quite fits the character yet and I've got to come up with a solution, or I'm too tired and I'm not hearing their voices. Because, So mostly, in answer to your question, yes, it sounds the way that it has in my head.
And the timing must be so important to get the right amount of words in. I know it can be altered when it's recording, but it's important in the script. Do you actually end up acting it out with the different characters and doing their different accents to get the timing, or is it just automatic for you now?
I wish I did. That sounds kind of fun. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to involve anybody else because we can never tell anyone. So, where you normally have a play and you have a few trusted friends you can get to do a read-through with you. Not generally. There's a kind of suggestion of a word count, but that is because some of our younger characters speak quicker, certain characters will always take longer, tone and pace will change depending on the emotion of the scene and even your sound effects. We also suggest cuts, which, we'd like to say in our precious moments of being precious as writers, that nothing really should be cut because we only write what we want broadcast. We don't. But there is obviously little moments, which sometimes that is a shame. They'll try their best to get everything in. So then it's down to the editors and the director to get it to the strict time. But a lot of them have been working for a long time on the show and they're good at that. But yeah, I think most writers, even though it was August that we wrote it and I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what was in each episode, if something has changed, I immediately know.
Yeah.
If a line's had to be changed or something's cut, I'm like, wasn't quite what
Yes. You mentioned just now that wonderful line you wrote this week from Eddie. He spoke to you saying all that glitters wasn't built in a day, which is a beautiful line. Last week we had the pleasure of interviewing Lucy Speed, who is, plays Stella. And in her honour, we had a T-shirt made to reflect another great line. Did you see it?
It's brilliant.
So I'm wearing it in your honour this week because you've come up with lesbian 007. So my question to you...
That's going to be on the back.
My question to you, are you scriptwriters building a franchise of these fantastic lesbian lines?
Yeah, that's mostly. Just in case. I write for Doctors, BBC Doctors, which has been axed this week, which is really sad news. Don't think the BBC will ever touch the Archers, but I don't want to be blasé about these things. So obviously our line of T-shirts of, iconic lines is where us writers are going.
Keep them coming, Sarah, please. That's some great lines. Yes.
I did have quite early on, I can't remember exactly what it was, but I had Emma say a line to Brian that one of the listeners embroidered and actually sent to me, which I have up in my bedroom. So that was really nice.
Lucy has promised us she's going to wear this on set, so can you hold on to that? And we need some pictures of her wearing this on set. Yes.
That's great. Yeah, I met Lucy. I actually wrote the episode 20,000th anniversary. So we had a bit of a get together in Birmingham. The team of writers and producers meet each other. We sometimes go on set. I mean, I started writing during the pandemic, so for a long time I didn't meet anybody in person. Though we had the really nice thing of we had Zoom read-through that the actors do on Zoom. So as the writers, we could join that. So that was nice. And I kind of wish that still happened. But so there hasn't been many chances to see the actors. So this was great. I saw Lucy and actually my episodes that are on this week had been recorded in Birmingham that day. So I was actually talking to the actors about that, which again is something you don't normally get.
Now, we should say that we are recording this on Friday of your week. So we have heard episodes up to Thursday, but we're not going to talk about tonight's episode, even though people will be listening to this on Saturday once they've heard it. We're going to keep this spoiler free. Accepting that, I'm just interested in, you mentioned this pack that you get and it sets some things out perhaps in detail and others not in detail. Did it include, gems that Eddie would make this speech to Oliver, or that Alistair would talk about the length of worms that turkeys have? I mean, where was your fairy dust on this, Sarah?
Yes, it's interesting because it depends, because things change throughout the whole process right to the very end. Like I say, even beyond our scripts, things will change because occasionally actor availability changes. Sometimes, particularly some of the very experienced actors will just say something, a line in a slightly different way. I don't know whether that's, I've not been in the studio enough to know how that happens. But so it didn't say Eddie says something funny. It's not as prescriptive as that. You have the loose storylines, but the Alistair storyline about turkeys, and actually the problem changed because we talk a lot to the agricultural editors, so they'll have an input into the story pack, but they will also be involved throughout the process. And all our agricultural editors I've worked with have been amazing. They tend to get back to you within about 30 seconds of you sending an email to ask something. And so I'd been told then at some point about these worms, and then I do some of my own research, and that's where the character comes in, I suppose, and the conversation and the fun of it. It struck me. That was what I found interesting, how long these worms were. So that's, and it'll depend. So no, I mean, there's never any dialogue or suggestion of dialogue. It tends to be plot. Though occasionally, and certainly we have a story meeting where we'll discuss, all the writers on that pack will be there, as well as the agricultural editor and all the production team. So we'll chat about stuff, and sometimes it'll be another writer will say something about my week that I think, oh, that's gold. You write it down and definitely use it. So the whole thing is collaborative, even though it feels like you spend that week and a half kind of sat at your computer on your own, frantically writing. Our archive is amazing. The people who work with the archive. I've never worked on a show that's been as wonderfully obsessive. I know we occasionally, our listeners basically could do that job too, some of our listeners, I think, and they sometimes, find the odd error. But generally not. I think that it's really, really carefully done. And we check everything we think to check anyway. I might check that, even like a character, whether they had a dog as a child. And maybe it's never been mentioned. Then you have the opportunity to invent whether they did or they didn't, and whether whether it fits their character that they had a traumatic experience with it or not. But if they did have a dog as a child, you certainly don't want to say they didn't, because our listeners will know.
Yeah. There were two standout scenes to me so far this week, Sarah, and which has been a very interesting week. I mean, Lee losing it with Helen was fantastic, because at last he's actually had the courage to stand up to Helen, who's been crushing him for months, hasn't she? But the other scene that was stand out for me was beautifully written as well, I have to say, by you, was the one where Linda is reflecting with Pip on how she fell in love with Robert.
Yeah.
I mean, it was beautifully done, beautifully written, beautifully acted, but I couldn't help but feel, because as sadly as we know, the actor who plays Robert has died in real life. Was that very much a requiem for Robert?
Yeah, there was that certainly in our minds, and I know that the team had spoken to Carol before I even wrote it, to see how she felt about doing that scene, and she was very keen to do it. And so I think there's those moments, and you don't get them every week, where you get a chance slightly to kind of break out of it still was naturalistic. She's talking to Pip, but it feels quite an honour, I think, certainly for a character like Linda, and in memory of Robert, to write something like that. And yes, so loads of research, you're given research with your storylines from the archive about their relationship, and then I also was asking questions as I was developing it. But you just have to kind of embody Linda, and I wrote for Robert as well. That was great. I wrote some nice episodes with Robert in, and she did it beautifully. I mean, it was, again, that kind of thing is when you listen as the writer and you've written it, and you've kind of heard. That's maybe coming back to your question about, do you hear it? There's the times where it totally transcends what you've written, because the actor takes it on and does something with it that is so beautiful. And that was from her heart. And actually, I spoke to her that night at the 20,000th episode, and she actually held my hand and said, how that in the recording it was very emotional. And so that you don't get those kind of connections usually, especially in the days of working quite remotely, So that was actually a beautiful moment, and something I won't forget as a writer for The Archers.
Another scene I've loved this week, I mean, it's just been a great week, but another scene was with Alan and Henry, and Alan actually parenting Henry better than Helen is doing. Presumably and we don't want any spoilers, but presumably you are aware of what lies ahead, and you can reflect that in the writing that you're doing.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, we do know to some extent, though, like I say, things do change. It's not like... We have long-term stories, and we have short-term stories, and we have what you're writing that day, and all of them can, there's a certain amount of flexibility, or it can change everything, so you can't totally rely on what you know that's coming up. But I think so. I think, even without it being consciously, you have in your mind where certain stories are going. But I'm not going to say anything.
No, don't. But can I just ask about red herrings? Because I've got some things wrong this week. Quentin got it right. I got it wrong. I thought it was George that had done the spraying on the church door and had got Henry to take the blame for that. So Quentin got that one right. But
along with lots of others.
Have you got scoreboards?
Yeah, I was reading too much into it. But do you delight in sometimes dropping in red herrings that we all zoom in on, and then we're looking in the wrong direction?
Yes, I think so. Or sometimes you've given... Yeah, I mean, there's a balance. You don't want to just totally wrong foot the audience too often, and you want to give hints that make it reasonable. So yes, there is that. So I think some writers do it more. I think I don't do it as much as other writers. Also, I find it so interesting when I haven't put in a red herring and or a clue, and somebody people read it as a clue. So that's kind of nice. I mean, it probably depends how busy I am in writing and home life. Depends how much I might look at Twitter or Facebook. But I am on Twitter and Facebook, and I do see some of those comments. And so sometimes, you get kind of hooked down a thing of like, oh my goodness, I think this, and this is, and how? And then realising that something you've written totally without thinking about it has sent people down. And even there was music once in a scene I wrote between Beth and Ben where they were having a bedroom picnic. Oh. And I'd chosen a track because my kids like it, the oldest is a similar age to Beth and Ben. So I was like, oh, that's the kind of music people, and that was all. But the lyrics in it were about a woman who was pregnant and running away from a family, and somebody had heard that, knew the song, and thought it was a clue to a future storyline. It's like, oh my goodness, it kind of makes you feel a responsibility, although that was light enough for what you are writing, how closely it's listened to.
Sarah, I've got to ask you, because it's alluded to without us being told, but as you say, the characters speak to you in your head. So what were the obscene words that Henry sprayed on the door of St. Stephen's?
Well, Kerry wrote the end of last week and I wrote this week. So we had a lot of fun. And actually, we spent more time than you might imagine talking about what it was going to be, even though it was never going to be on air. Exactly. We had lots and lots of different versions of what might have been written. Did you ask me what the word was?
Well, we probably can't say it, but I mean, are we talking 4 letters here or longer, Sarah?
Yeah, I think probably if listeners are kind of betting on 4 letters, that's quite a good.
Okay.
Bet.
We'll leave it there. We'll park it there.
It wasn't a competing cheese then to Helen's. That's what I was wondering. It wasn't Celia's cheese.
Yes. Oh my goodness, that would have been great. Do you know what? Yeah, that would have been great. That would have really upset Helen. So when she said obscene, she really meant obscene.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Well, talking of cheese, Sarah, Philippa is obsessed. That is not too strong a word, with any mention of food on the Archers, and she compiles a whole list. Well, I was going to say, is that something that you as writers consciously insert into the script? And I just wonder, is it sort of part of the subtext? Are you trying to tell us something with the food that's constantly mentioned?
Well, I guess we're in a farming world, so that people are producing food. This is an excuse. It's because I like food in my weeks, and because a lot of my socialising and family life is around food. I have had weeks where I saw pointed out how many times crisps have been mentioned, which I love crisps. I try not to eat too many, obviously, like all of us, but I do it vicariously through my characters in The Bull. I also think as well, we are writing scenes where we're having to have busy working farmers talking to each other. And, we try as much as possible to put them in their work environments, but sometimes that's not possible. So the times they see each other tend to be around breaks and lunchtimes and evening, and it's that relaxation. But yeah, I again, it comes down to different writers. It's been suggested sometimes I cut some of my food references because, you can just get into the scene quicker.
Yes.
If I'm having them making elaborate meals and then they get talking about the murder in the village or whatever,
Well, it takes up about 2 minutes of our podcast every week because Philippa's going through the list of food, so yeah. Yeah,
well, good. And I shall think of you, Philippa, when I'm writing it. And when I'm arguing, to keep all of my food references in the script, how absolutely essential they are, I'll
People love them
as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's not just me.
I think as well, village life maybe is a bit different to city life. I don't know. I grew up in a village, but it was a long time ago, so maybe it was just a different time. But I think there is that sense of you sit down at the table and you have a meal at the end of your working day. I don't know. I'm just making excuses. I like food.
Well, I love it. And yes, lots of listeners to our podcast love it as well. So yes, please keep the food references coming, Sarah. But I wanted to ask you about the actors, because they know who's writing which weeks. Do they suddenly sort of befriend you and ask you out for coffee when you're going to be writing to try and get more scenes?
No, none of them seem as Machiavellian as that. That's not my experience. But yeah, maybe they should, to get more scenes, or just to write no, they haven't. But I don't know what the experience of other writers is. That would be a good idea. Maybe you've put that out there now.
Yes, you're suddenly going to get the invite.
To charm the writers to get excited.
Sarah, I'm struck by how underwhelmed Ambridge is about Pip and Stella coming out. Well, Pip is certainly coming out. And I saw this on Twitter from Steve Brooks, and he says, I love the way no one is even slightly fazed by Pip's same-sex relationship, even though she's doing her level best to freak them out. And underneath, Elizabeth Wilhide says, yes, it's quite funny and well written. So
that's nice.
Yeah, exactly. So is this a strategy of the scriptwriter to say, look, it's no big deal, whatever, however Pip wants to be the centre of attention about all this, actually nobody's bothered. I mean, even Jill was considering her pronouns, for goodness sake.
I don't know. I thought maybe Jill had a slight edge to her, that she was.
Well, I was surprised.
Being slightly awkward about it, because I think Jill probably understands that being a lesbian doesn't change your pronouns. I think she had that slight cheeky naughtiness about her.
But is the idea to play it down?
Well, I mean, we had the story early on with Ruth, and her, which absolutely wasn't homophobia, but it was the struggling with the relationship and everything.
Yeah.
I don't know how much to say. Yeah, I mean, I was my revelation to Linda, that was this week really, was I mean, Alistair's sister is a lesbian, so I think he was, because I had that as well. I think that was quite natural that it wouldn't be something, or certainly even if he was surprised, he would kind of be quite versed in not showing that it wasn't surprised by their relationship. Linda, in my mind, I felt like she might have had some hint of this. She might have heard in the village already that it wasn't totally the first she'd heard of it. And that, she's a woman of the world. And it is 2023, 2023, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Still at the moment. Yeah. So it wasn't, I don't think it's been like a party line, but I grew up in a small village in North Lincolnshire, and my mum still lives there, and I go back there, and I think in my mind as well, I didn't want this idea that people from the big cities think that, we haven't heard of a lesbian couple in a small Lincolnshire village or a small Midlands village or whatever. So I think that, when I wrote that scene, Linda already had some hint and was just happy for them. She's just talked about falling for the person, and whoever that person is, it's who makes you happy. And I know people that age. These are people who grew up in the 60s now. We're not. There's lots of people open-minded.
I mean, somebody else pointed out on Twitter, the only thing, Pip just has to tell Susan, and then that job done. The whole village will know.
Yes. Yes. Well, that was kind of like that was my thought when Stella said, what not, have it chatted about in the village shop, that they actually were deciding to make a splash with it. But I mean, lots of village know already, so yeah.
Yes.
Sad that they can't get their Grey Gables moment, though.
Yeah.
Ooh, Grey Gables.
Yes, we have.
What's going on there, Sarah?
Yeah.
What is going on? Chaos.
Well, I can't possibly.
What have you done with Ardle?
Yeah, I can't possibly say.
Well, we're conscious of time. One final question for you, which is, if you were to have 5 minutes in Ambridge yourself, whose door would you be knocking on to say hello? Who would you want to spend a bit of time with?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I would really like to. I love Brad and Chelsea. It would be Jazza, Tracy, Brad and Chelsea, absolutely. I mean, I know I've written egg and chips, eggs, beans and chips in their storylines multiple times. It's one of my favourite meals, preferably for breakfast. If you can get chips in at the start of the day, then it's going to be a good day. So, breakfast with chips with the Horrobins, definitely.
Perfect. Well, it's just been wonderful to talk to you, Sarah. Honestly, it really has. And we appreciate your support of the podcast and just talking to us all about it. Sarah Hehir, scriptwriter for The Archers. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much,
Thank
Sarah.
you for having me, and enjoy the Friday episode as well.
Oh, we will.
Everyone will have heard it already. Won't they? No, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
No,
thank you.
Care.